Hi, everyone. Lori MacVittie again. I'm the Distinguished Engineer and Chief Evangelist for F5. We're here to talk about one of the items on the ADC top 10 list. And I promised and brought back Ken, who's going to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Ken Arora. I'm with the Office of CTO, Distinguished Engineer and product guy. Worked on Big IP for a long time, and if you've seen me before, you've heard it. Hi, Lori. What do we want to talk about today?
What do I want to talk? I, I want to talk about ADC6, which is inability to handle latency, which is a significant problem, at least on a user end, because I can't handle latency. It really irritates me. So, when we say inability to handle latency in reference to application delivery challenges, what does that mean?
Cool. Yeah. Okay. Cool. When you were saying that, I kept that Nicholson line flashed like, "You can't handle the latency."
I can't.
For those of you who've seen a few of these other talks, we've mentioned this theme has come up before, where the ADC 1.0 world and even the 2.0 world to a fair extent sort of was all about handling the throughput, saying how do I maximize the number of requests per second that I'm getting through there. If you made a trade-off to increase the latency, that was fine. And for some apps that weren't particularly latency sensitive, that was okay. Like, if it takes me an extra half second to purchase my Amazon item or my retail item, that might be some friction. It might affect the user experience, but that's well quantified, and people probably will put up with that. If, on the other hand, it takes me a extra half second for, as a owner of a Tesla, for my Tesla to go up to the cloud and realize there's a stop sign there, that could be bad. That could have some real consequences. Um,
Mhm.
and so there are latency sensitive apps. There are also what we call jitter sensitive apps, which is sort of a corollary to inability to handle latency. There are apps like audio apps that can, or video, where they can handle a certain amount of latency, but they don't want there to be variation in that latency. Like, okay, if everything is delayed by half a second, but everything's consistent about that, that's okay. I want to just throw out one more app just so people can get grounded. I think what's getting popular now is real-time translation, sort of the Babel fish in your ear.
Mhm.
And those are another example of a latency sensitive app. Doesn't need a lot of throughput. Speech in the grand scheme of things isn't that much bandwidth. But if, when somebody says something and I don't speak their language, if it's going to take a second for that to show up my ear, that's probably going to be disconcerting.
Yeah, and if you put it into like real-time gaming terms, right? Gamers would say, right, they're ping, right? Having it consistent means you can get used to it and you know how to respond to it. But when it's like spiking or dropping, right, it creates a horrible experience, right?
Absolutely. And another theme that's happened, been really taken off in the last few years, is right this idea that my app is composed of all of these SaaS services. So I go to an Identity SaaS service, I go to somebody for my storage, I go somewhere else for my credit card payment, and so now apps are much more built as a serial cascade of all these services. So now, your latency isn't, okay, it's a big monolithic app and my latency is half a second. Now I don't have a big monolithic app. My app is really 10 mini apps that are all back to back. And so if I have half a second for each, that all of a sudden adds up to, 5 seconds. That's an unacceptable delay.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we forget, right? You got to everything chains, right? It's not just one call. We're not client server days anymore. We're microservices and SaaS. And I mean, it's just all a big mess in there, right? And so that all adds up. So
Yeah.
if an organization, right, has these applications, they're aware and they say, okay, latency here is bad, but it's bad in different ways for different applications, then what can they do about it?
So there are a lot of things you can do, and I'll also throw in one more angle that we'll talk about, which is differentiated clients. Some customers should, either because of who they are, how much they're paying, or the nature of that workflow, need to be faster. So what can we do about it, to answer your question? The best answer spans the entire delivery chain. And so starts with, maybe I want to send this to an edge. And maybe I'll use GSLB and DNS to help me with that, so that I can say, okay, this is really latency sensitive. I'm going to run it at something closer to the client, and so that whole transmission delay is a lot a lot better. Where if I'm living in Washington, if I can service that request somewhere in Washington State, that's a lot better than going to a data center in New York. Other thing you can do is you can build in, and you should build in, knowledge of the type of app into your application delivery policy. Um, right. So you've heard me diss on round robin. That may not be the best way of doing things. You might say, okay, which server in the server pool has the shortest queue? So that's one thing. And then you can do other things, but I'll pause for a second. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. And thank you for dissing on round robin, right? Let's remind everyone round robin bad, anything else good, or at
Right.
least better. It's important. And yeah, I like um the routing analogy there. Well, not analogy, but the routing example, because that's again, to go back to gaming. I've got gaming on the mind today. Right, that's your. I'm going to play on this. They call them servers, right? I'm going to play on this server because it's closest and it's got the least latency, as opposed to playing, I don't know, across the world, right? So they need to optimize based on that for performance. So that all
Yeah.
makes sense.
We're going to run out of time, so I'll give just people quickly two more things. One is another thing to do, like especially in gaming, remind me of this, is stickiness, right? So you want to, in terms of another load balancing algorithm, you want to say, hey, things from from the same client should always end up on the same server, so that that request can get processed more quickly, right? In other words, if I've got a pool of servers and I'm playing, I don't know, Madden or some sports game, I don't want something going to one server for when I pass the ball and going to another server for the receiver catching the ball, because they have to talk to each other, and that's going to that's going to mess with the experience. Last thing I want to leave people with, because we are big IP, is sometimes can't think of all these things up front, so you need programmability, and this is the power of iRules, which we haven't touched on in some of our other conversations. But iRules, the ability to program and programmatically say, this is how I want to optimize the business logic, depending on the type of client or the type of request. That's really a powerful thing you're going to want in your ADC.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely, right. The power of programmability is huge, but I'm glad you mentioned things like stickiness, because that's really getting into the difference between the network, which doesn't have an awareness of existing sessions and how that works, right? They have flows, but really part of the ADC's job is to track those sessions so that we can eliminate the TCP handshake time, which
Mhm.
actually does contribute significantly to poor performance if you're constantly having to go through that process. So
Mhm.
there's tons of things that we can do about latency and reducing it and optimizing across all your applications so that every application is dealing with the right amount of latency, if there is such a thing. My teenager would say, no, there is not. It should have
Mhm.
been here already.
Mhm.
But this is a significant problem that enterprises should definitely look at, and that's why it's on our list,
Yep.
right?
Yep. Yep. Makes sense. Yeah. And I love gaming. It's great. A lot of gaming uses UDP, and that's something that does your load balancer support UDP? Something to ask yourself.
It's a good question. I know ours do, so we're good, but you're right, some other ones might not. So, all right, two things to do. One, right, figure out which apps can handle latency and which ones can't. Oh, I
Mhm.
guess three, get rid of round robin and check if they can handle UDP in case you're going to be delivering games. So thanks, Ken. This was great. And until next time, right?
Uh-huh.
Deliver
Right.
fast.
Handle latency.